Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, or whenever you happen to be listening to this. Welcome to the Film Realist Podcast, the film and TV podcast from a complete nobody. That is hopefully for somebody. My name is Kal Naranya, and welcome to episode 159. And on this week's episode, I will be reviewing Nobody 2. Bob Odenkirk comes back to kick some more ass. No need to worry, there will be a non-spoiler review as well as a spoiler-filled review. So if you haven't had a chance to see the movie yet, there is part of this episode for you. And as usual, I will wrap up the episode by responding to listener mail and comments. Let's jump into Nobody 2 non-spoiler review.
What's up, guys?
More than you know. You were told to leave.
So what are you still doing in town, old man?
I'm here with my family, making memories.
He's making memories, huh?
There's no need for this. This is all a big misunderstanding.
Nobody 2 is really interesting because its continuation is very much in line with what you'd expect from Derek Kolstad, who wrote Nobody 1 and was one of the minds behind the John Wick franchise, specifically the first one, Chapter 2 and Chapter 3. And one of my favorite things about watching the Nobody films is I know Bob Odenkirk from How I Met Your Mother as Arthur Hobbs. And seeing that guy who was Marshall's boss and this lawyer who was obsessed with his dog Tugboat in these action movies, and I know a lot of people would know Bob Odenkirk from Better Call Saul and Breaking Bad, and yes, of course, those are definitive performances within his career, but Bob Odenkirk is more known as a comedic sketch comedy writer. He worked on SNL, The Mr. Nobody Show, Larry Sanders, and a bunch of other things. But Nobody does the same thing we saw from the other elements of this franchise, which is this genre within action of taking somebody you wouldn't necessarily suspect would be capable of handling themselves in an action movie. And it was obviously noticed that Bob Odenkirk put in the work for Nobody 1. Nobody 2, unlike the John Wick franchise, and this I would not consider a spoiler given how it is addressed as the setup within both of the trailers for this. There only was the official trailer and then a tickets are on sale trailer, but the John Wick franchise famously introduced us to the world of assassins and the High Table and all of the factions within it, and each John Wick sequel continued to give us a further in-depth look at the world of the High Table. And we got to see different representatives from different levels throughout the films, and of course, we finally did actually get to see High Table members, and John Wick was a man at war against the whole hypocrisy that he was once a servant of. Nobody 2 does the complete opposite of that. It feels much more in line with action franchises from before this 87-11/87 North era of action, which is you just get more. That's not necessarily a bad thing. A lot of what the selling point is for these action films, not dissimilar to the Mission Impossibles, is the stunts and the action. These are not going for the spectacle of stunt like Mission Impossible. What they're going for is choreographed action and crazy kills in unique environments. The first film did that the same, and then that this film's placing the setting in an amusement park allows for comical deaths or severe deaths the only way you could imagine them. And Timu Chayantu, who directed this film, really takes the expectations and he meets them, and that's not a negative. Unfortunately, the film just feeling like more doesn't make it nearly as memorable as the first, where the success in something, and there's going to be lots of comparisons to John Wick. That is the most apt comparison you can have with this franchise. A lot of the creators involved with this have worked on those things as well, as I've stated, which is not having a lore of exploration or having there to be more layers to be served to the audience. It feels much more disposable because the goal of the first one was selling Bob Odenkirk. Nobody two's question could be, do people just want more of this? The box office opening worldwide would indicate maybe not. Maybe the selling point of just more wasn't what people were looking for. Unfortunately for Nobody 2, and I'm not laughing at the circumstances, but it would appear that it opened 5th for the overall weekend, which is third for the overall weekend, behind Weapons and Freakier Friday. Freakier Friday, as I discussed last week, that was a 22-year waiting period for the return of those characters. Weapon is just another indicator that really well executed, intriguing, thought-provoking horror films are what's driving audiences to the theater for more weekends than big IP. And Nobody, while not nearly on the same level as the comic book franchises, this is a return to a franchise. The first film came out in 2021. It's been 4 years, and what's abundantly clear to me, having seen all of the action films in the theater this year, that including Love Hurts, Novocaine, Ballerina from the world of John Wick, and now Nobody 2, even with a recognizable star, and Bob Odenkirk is a star, of course, Ana de Armas is one as well, but as much as I love Ke Huy Quan and Jack Quaid, those actors were not able to sell those movies when they came out. Love Hurts was a film that was released within the February window, and Novocaine, which had a really unique premise, but was not able to do overly well. That came out only a month later. So many of these action movies, if they don't offer the level of spectacle that audiences feel almost has to be worth the price of admission, you're not necessarily able to sell that to people anymore. Less and less people are going to the theater, and that's become abundantly clear when you look at the evaluation of second weekend drops. And I don't want to get into the weeds necessarily on all of the money, because that part is not what's interesting, but unfortunately, it's a real indicator of where we're going. And a movie like Nobody 2 is not going to be a bankable film, unfortunately, anymore. And having watched it, the first film was a surprise, where Nobody 2 is a fun experience, but outside of Bob Odenkirk and I would say Connie Nielsen, the supporting cast is not given a ton to do. I love Christopher Lloyd. Seeing him as an old man shooting big guns is entertaining, but movies in this vein, we've had so many this year that would likely have been much more successful on streaming, and comparing them to the crop of what we actually get for streaming films is probably an indicator of what seems to be the separation. I like seeing these action movies on the big screen that are designed for that. Timu's direction and cinematography really does have multiple influences present in this that I appreciate. Not to mention that I'll never complain about seeing Connie Nielsen in a film. She's such a versatile actress, and her relationship with Hutch has one of such complexity where she being aware of what he is capable of and where he's putting himself, but still at the same time realizing the fact that even because of his commitments to his job, that there's a family and things are being missed out on, which is a relatively simple convention that we've seen in a fair amount of films, that unfortunately, it being so stereotypical, its use of that within the story doesn't really hold any water because we're not necessarily shown anything new in that realm. I like Hutch. I like Bob Odenkirk's character. His relationship with his government agency and his past are an interesting thing to explore, his relationship with his dad. And we are given glimpses of what the history is. And again, I don't want to keep bringing it up, but there is a great blueprint for what to do and what not to do. And I don't need these movies to be John Wick. there doesn't need to be a bigger conspiracy. But that would have made the investment of returning to these people work just as well. I'm really reminded while watching this movie, and I don't know if a lot of people would necessarily know this, but a lot of the plots for the Die Hard films were based on other books or other pitches, and then they were reworked into being Die Hard sequels. And Nobody 2, if you remove Hutch from the movie, it's just another action movie. And I think that's my biggest problem, which is this doesn't need to be somebody in their 60s or a suburban dad as the main hero. It just needs to be somebody surprising. And you might be thinking, listening to that, well, Kyle, that's the whole point of Nobody. He's somebody you wouldn't necessarily predict. And that's true, but the circumstances of why he's there seem to be much deeper in what Hutch's goals are. But the world around them is so cartoonishly predictable and elevated. Sharon Stone's performance in this, I'm a fan of hers, but it is on another level. It's not trying to be believable whatsoever. I like the supporting cast we get in this movie. John Ortiz, I like him. He's been in a lot of really fun movies, whether that be Bumblebee, Kong Skull Island, or Fast and Furious films, which he's in a number of them as Braga, or Colin Hanks. That guy can do a lot, and him as the sleazy sheriff is fun to watch, but the movie's actual plot, it's note for note things you would assume are going to happen, and I'm not saying that that's necessarily a bad thing, but on the flip side of that, you need to make your action sequences things that people are talking about coming out of the theater. And unfortunately, while they are fun to watch, there is not an action sequence in this definitively that is one that is so memorable, it's going to be something I'm going to be talking about for the remainder of August. There's going to be a number of projects releasing in the next couple months that I'm assuming will have more compelling action. And that's the biggest crime in an action movie, is the last thing you want it to be is forgettable. The movie sort of falls in line with what you would expect based on the first film. And that's another issue I have, which is the movie is fun on its own, but it doesn't one-up the spectacle or the awesomeness of the first one, and it kind of falls in line with doing very similar things, which made my immersion less significant because I started to get reminded of scenes from the previous film. So I can't really talk about any of the key action sequences because those things would be spoilers. So let's do that. We're going to jump into spoilers now, where I can really dive into the action of the film and what made it a little disappointing. So spoilers are upcoming. You have been warned.
You really lit a fuse when you did that.
No. I think you did that. The moment you underestimated me. See, I've been pushed around for long enough.
All right, so I described some of the setup for this, but now we're in full spoilers. So one of the things that's really interesting is this is a direct sequel outside of the setup for most of the movie, which is because of Hutch burning all the money in the previous one, the organization had to pay off his debt with the Russian mob, which I find interesting that that's the case because he did the right thing, but I guess it's one of those aspects where this is a level of exploration that would have made the movie much more interesting, because if there's a shadiness to the government he's working for or the organization he's working for, let's dive into that. Is Hutch going to come up against the organization that he owes money to, or are we just going to say this is why he's doing all those things? And that's kind of what happens, and that's really disappointing because, again, I don't need this to be, wow, there's a secret society of assassins like the High Table, but having him come to grips with a choice he made and the people he's supposed to be working for are shady, that would have been an interesting connection because he's given backstory on the drug running through Plummerville from his brother Riza, as well as the organization. But maybe if there was much more of a connection with them, because this doesn't feel as if it moves the ball forward or down the hill or up the hill, whichever metaphor you want to use for the progression of the second film in a franchise. It just feels like another one. And because Hutch has been doing all this work, this is why they go on the vacation to Plummerville. It's a place that Hutch's dad took him and his brother to when they were kids. And another piece of information that just winds up going nowhere is Riza tells Hutch that we went here because Dad was working. Let's get into that. This organization that's been using this as a money laundering scheme or a front for this drug cartel, do they know Hutch's dad? That would have been really interesting as the inciting incident, that there's history here, which is why everything hits the fan, as opposed to the anger management that Hutch clearly deals with, and we can see that his son is dealing with. But the resolution on that is Hutch's son connects with the guy he beat up, who was likely going to assault him, and Hutch is the inciting incident to the whole event because somebody smacks his daughter on the back of the head after Hutch's son got into a fight within the arcade of Plummerville. And the ball starts rolling after that, where Hutch starts learning more and more as to what's been involved with Plummerville's shadiness. One pivot I did appreciate is that John Ortiz's character, who is the corrupt owner of the park, is working for somebody else, and he's doing so begrudgingly because of the actual big bad of the movie, which is Sharon Stone's character. But the flip with his character after Hutch saves his son, burning more money, which didn't really feel like there was any continuance from the previous movie, which from a writing standpoint, I don't understand. We have the imagery of Hutch burning the Russians' money in the first film. It's brought up here. As I mentioned, he is working under the debt of the organization because they paid off the Russians for what he did. And there doesn't seem to be any repercussions explained or even presented in this. He begrudgingly burns the money when dealing with Colin Hanks as the shady sheriff, who it turns out is actually working for Sharon Stone and not John Ortiz. But you introduce imagery that should be relevant to our main character for it to seemingly be dropped. And the thing that frustrates me about that is I don't see a Nobody 3 happenings after the weekend box office that this movie just had. And I'm reminded of, I can't remember specifically where I heard this quote. It might have honestly been from Kevin Feige, which I'm sure people are going to be reacting to super positively now, given where the MCU is. But all your best ideas you should put into the movie as long as they cohesively work. I'm paraphrasing, but not to deliberately save stuff. What I find super annoying about that with this is there is enough connective tissue to the previous one that could have made this movie feel like a sequel as opposed to another adventure. This movie, if it had had just a subtitle as opposed to a number, I think would have made way more sense. It's just the next adventure. But the movie goes out of its way to say, hey, look, I'm a sequel. Remember this thing from the last one? It's important for it to get dropped and not come up again. We don't even have a scene where we see Hutch dealing with the repercussions of burning more money. The organization doesn't call and they go, dude, you already burned $25 million. What are you doing that again? Where if we had some sort of connective tissue where they, even though the organization is aware of Sharon Stone, it doesn't feel like, oh, you really need to get out of there and the escape needs to be the important part. The action sequences teased in all the trailers, that's pretty much it, outside of the finale, which I mentioned in non-spoilers, is very much so just a copy of the previous film where it's Home Alone-esque with all the henchmen coming in and them falling into traps, and the creative ways in which they can kill people. I liked that in the first one because it felt like the group of RZA, Bob Odenkirk, and Christopher Lloyd were on the back foot, so they would have to draw everybody in. And I would have appreciated it so much more as opposed to doing something that felt inherently the same except for the setting. And there are some fun gags that only work because this is at an amusement park. I think it would have been much more interesting to flip that on its head. And even though we had a kidnapping already in the movie, what if Sharon Stone's character kidnapped Bob Odenkirk's family at the amusement park, and we had a gauntlet that our protagonist had to go through? Bob Odenkirk and John Ortiz having to fight through the different areas as opposed to having all the traps set up. I would have really liked to see Bob Odenkirk have to improvise, getting into an area, having to figure stuff out, and then him using what's in front of him being the other amusement park props and setting to kill the other people. But the Home Alone trapness felt like We Are Nobody 2. We just have to do another thing like Nobody 1, which for an action franchise, you really have to sell the uniqueness of the sequel. We are here because we are familiar with the protagonist, and you want to see the protagonist in crazy circumstances. I know the Die Hard franchise has a mixed reception with, 5 is absolutely garbage, but 2 being in the airport and on Christmas Day, it just being Christmas Day on the calendar is fun, but you get to see a wide variety of skirmishes with John McClane. 3 is then in New York, and 4 is much grander in terms of spectacle with airplanes and highways and elevator shafts. I like the amusement parkness of this. It is a colorful and interesting setting and something a lot of viewers would be familiar with. As opposed to grand amusement parks, it is much more smaller scale. And it does give Nobody 2 a very distinctive look. I appreciate the vacation elements of this, but so much of the film feels very predictable as to where people are going to be. I would have really appreciated, given that this is the 5th action film from Derek Kolstad, to flip conventions on their head. We get Connie Nielsen being awesome because Connie Nielsen is awesome. I like her ultimately being the person who takes down Sharon Stone in a fun way, using the tranquilizer darts from the gun to shoot her in the body and then into the eye, blocking the knife. Visually, that's really cool. I would say it's undercut by the conclusion of Nobody 1, which was Hutch running at somebody with a sheet of ballistic glass and then blowing up. Ironically, Ballerina, which was written by Shay Hatton, had a grenade fight in its film earlier this year. So that to me leaves me wanting more, and I don't like that from an action film where, I said in non-spoilers, I want to have a sequence where I go, oh my god, you need to watch Nobody 2 because this happened, and you have to see that on the big screen, where ultimately I had a fun time with this, but the more I thought about it critically, the more it would lead me to suggest this is probably a streamer and not worth the big screen, which is disappointing because I did quite like the first one. So that will do it for my spoiler review of Nobody 2. Let's jump into listener mail.
Can I ask you a question? Just fun?
There's something I've been meaning to ask you.
I ask the questions, you answer the questions.
Why do you ask questions to which you already know the answers?
Did that count as a question?
Yes.
Damn it.
Last week's question of the week was, what project, so TV show or film, introduced you to Bob Odenkirk? Noah on TikTok said, Better Call Saul. Scotty Cameron wrote in, it's Breaking Bad. I mean, Saul Goodman was a standout, hence why he got a spin-off show about him. I will say I am familiar with his work on SNL. After all, he was involved with the show at its peak and the infamous episode hosted by Steven Seagal. That episode is probably famous for a myriad of reasons because of how awful Seagal was as a host, and it's the most standing Seagal has done on camera without a double. Knowing that Odenkirk had to write for that episode just makes it more iconic. Dylan writes in, Breaking Bad is definitely the first thing where I actively remembered Bob Odenkirk's name, but earliest role where he stood out to me was in Curb Your Enthusiasm, where he played the porno Gil and made Larry and Cheryl uncomfortable with his hot sauce in the ass story. That is just a bunch of words I really wish I didn't have to say. Thank you to everybody who submitted their answers to Question of the Week. Now, this week's Question of the Week. Based on Peacemaker Season 2 coming out next week, what other character from the Suicide Squad would you like to see the DCU? Peacemaker, of course, was introduced to us in James Gunn's The Suicide Squad. With Season 2 coming out, I'm curious which of those characters you would like to see. To answer the Question of the Week, you can comment below. You can email the podcast, filmreelistspod@gmail.com, or you can @filmreelist on any of the social medias, or comment when the Question of the Week social media post goes up. That's usually Thursdays or Fridays, so make sure you're following the podcast on whatever your preferred social media platform is. We have a new review on iTunes, which is super exciting. It is from Try My Utmost, and it said 5 stars, down to earth. Kyle's reviews are fun, and I really love the perspective in which he reviews films. They aren't on all the same scale. Couldn't recommend more. Thank you so much for that review. I will read it on the podcast, and if I have something that has a question that's posted in it, I will usually respond to that on the podcast as well. There's going to be a couple things upcoming that I'm sure people will have serious opinions about, so I look forward to seeing that. As teased already, next week's episode of the podcast is going to be a review of Peacemaker Season 2, Episode 1, so you can look forward to that on your regularly scheduled programming. As of now, there is nothing scheduled that's going to be bonus. If you don't want to miss any bonus reviews or coverage, make sure you are following the podcast on your preferred podcast platform. If you haven't yet, subscribe on YouTube, leave 5 stars, all those amazing things that help the podcast reach further into the algorithm. Comment on YouTube, all of the social media interactions. I love having conversations with listeners about topics that may be news related that I won't bring up on the podcast. So @FilmRealist, if you have a question, you can also email that in, and I will react to it and answer the question on the podcast if you don't have an answer for Question of the Week. Thank you so much to everybody for listening to the Film Realist podcast. My name is Kyle Naranya, and I will see you next time.